he initially saw 8 patients that had a similar cluster of symptoms, the swearing, the involuntary movement, the impulsivity and such, and he was the first person that thought, well, geez, we should maybe put a name to this. He himself, when he wrote a paper with a fellow by the name of Charcot, called it Maladie de tic, literally the tick sickness, and has gone under a number of name changes since then. It was known as the Wandering Jew disease at one point. Freud, when he got a hold of the disorder, decided that it was a symbolic manifestation of the repressed need to masturbate. So it's had a lot of different names and a lot of different conceptions over time. But in 1978, a doctor by the name of Shapiro wrote a book called Tourette Syndrome, where he coined the disorder after Georges-Gilles de la Tourette, the original founder.
So it was only 22 years ago that this was actually given a name.
Exactly, and very misunderstood up to that point. I mean, certainly I'm glad I wasn't born 200 years ago, because I probably would have had my skull trifened, or they would have bled the evil spirits out. But even over the last 100 years, I mean, we were seen as I say, repressing sexual urges by Freud. We were seen as genetically inferior around World War II time. We were seen as behavior problems, or, we needed a good swift kick so we'd be more motivated to not act like idiots, even as, late as the 60s and 70s. And so it's only been in the last 20 years or so that quite a bit of more serious neurological and psychological research has been done into the disorder to see that it's indeed a valid condition.
Now you say we, so you have Tourette's.
I have Tourette's myself. I actually wear a number of hats. I do research in Tourette syndrome. I hope to work clinically in the next year with people with Tourette syndrome, and yes, I experienced the disorder myself.
Okay. How many people have Tourette syndrome? I guess we'll say in Canada or worldwide. I don't know if you have numbers.
Sure. Well, I'll give, rather than numbers, I'll give you percentages.
Okay.
Traditionally, Tourette syndrome was thought to be quite rare. It was believed maybe 1 in 20,000 people had this disorder, but as more and more information, awareness is presented, people are realizing more and more that it is more prevalent, that people just seem to be coming out of the woodwork now, whereas people were misdiagnosed or just, told that they had nervous habits or what before, they now realize there's a name for this. So as a result, the prevalence ratings continue to rise. The official stance of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada is that 1 in 200 people, half of 1%, have this disorder. But more recent research is going as high as 1 and even 3%. Of course, it's very much a flavor of the month right now. There's a lot of attention and focus on Tourette syndrome, so there's always the risk of overdiagnosis, that it's not really that unusual for very young children when they're developing to have a transient tic here and there. And so, while it's very good that people are watching closer and diagnosis is happening earlier, we also have to be careful not to go too far the other direction and mislabel people.
3%, that seems incredibly high. I mean, just given a look around the local community here, I wouldn't say 3%. Or is it masked? Am I just not seeing it?
Well, people with Tourette's actually didn't fall off the apple cart yesterday. There's some evidence to show that certainly the intelligence level is the same in people with Tourette's, and maybe in pure Tourette's may even be slightly higher than the average. And so these people know that what they're doing, they realize it looks bizarre, and they know they probably won't get too many dances at next Friday's prom if they're barking and shaking their head. And so you're absolutely right that people do what they call suppression. They work very hard to hold in their tics, and even when the tics slip out, people with Tourette's can get quite clever in masking how they come out. It's a term that the doctors use called perikinesia, and basically what that means is that we'll turn a violent mouth opening tic into a fake yawn, or if we have a snorting tic such as what I just did, they'll tag a laugh on the end of it to make it look like they just snort when they laugh. So there's a number of ways that they can slip their symptoms by people without them realizing what's going on.
I was reading an article in the Vancouver Sun, and it was on Grizzlies point guard Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, and he says that he masks it with a cough.
Yes. He's actually got a couple of neat perikinesic examples. I remember another one I heard at one point was that he had a touching tic where he needed to touch people on the shoulder. And so being a sports star and being black, he worked that touching tic into a whole routine where, he'd go up and touch on the shoulder and, hey, what's up? How's it going? And no one was the wiser because it just seemed to fit in with the whole part he was playing.
That's fabulous. What a way to integrate something that, is part of you, would make people uncomfortable, and make it so that they don't even recognize it's there.
Now, I have to say, suppression comes at a price. The best example that I can think of personally is think of suppressing an itch. Think of being covered with poison ivy or the chicken pox or mosquito bites or what have you, and not giving in to the urge to itch. And you can appreciate the more and more conscious effort it takes to hold off on those itches. They seem to loom larger and larger and larger and demand more and more of your attention and become more and more insistent. And eventually you have to give in. And when you do give in, there's somewhat of a rebound effect where you really dig into the itch for a while because you've held off for so long and it's distracted you so much. And suppressing a tic is very similar to that. It takes a lot of conscious effort, and afterwards, you tend to experience more tics as a result. This is where a lot of kids can get in trouble at school because, as I mentioned, they aren't stupid. They realize a lot of their peers might not understand and might laugh, and so the very last symptom they would ever want to let out are the various tics, except that can make their school experience even more difficult because suddenly they don't have any mental resources left to be able to pay attention to math because they're waging this inner war that no one has any idea is even going on. That would be your analogy to not being able to scratch an itch would be just, it'd be a hellish experience. Duncan, we need to take a short commercial break here, but please, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of Your Health. If you have a comment or question about Tourette syndrome, call us toll-free, 1-866-377-8255. Send us an email, yourhealth@essentialtalk.com, or go to the Daily Debate section, click on Your Health, and post your comments live. We'll be sure to address them after the break. Welcome back to Your Health. I'm Pamela Clark, and today we're talking about Tourette syndrome. Our guest is Duncan McKinley, a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo and director of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada. Duncan, before the break, you mentioned how a child spends a lot of their mental energy suppressing tics if they're in school or out in public. What are the symptoms generally of Tourette syndrome? Sure. I know we're going to talk about the various disorders that go along with Tourette syndrome a little bit later, and so I'll hold off on that for now and just talk about Tourette's in its purest form. To get diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, basically the criteria are that you have to have motor tics and phonic tics. Phonic tics are very radio-friendly. You get to hear a few of those, but hard to see my motor tics over the internet. You have to have both of those symptoms for more than a year. The symptoms aren't due to any sort of medicine or other medical conditions. So, for example, if you were taking a stimulant medication, that made you tick, but when you went off the stimulant medication, you were no longer ticking, that wouldn't be considered Tourette's. And basically also the symptoms have to occur before you're age 21. There's various disorders that can cause involuntary movements that can occur later in life, things like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and post-viral encephalitis and head trauma because of an accident. For these various different reasons, if you were to start involuntarily moving after the age 21, they wouldn't consider a diagnosis of Tourette's. So they're both motor and vocal tics that occur for more than a year that typically begin to manifest between the ages of 6 and 9, and 96% of the time they've manifested before the age 11. Why does it start at the age of 6 and 9? Is that when the brain is at a certain stage of development? They're not really sure. There are other aspects of the disorder, things like the attention deficit hyperactivity, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that can come out a little bit earlier. But it seems to be, just as there's various time delay genes that things are cued to manifest at certain points in life. similar, that it's around the ages of 6 to 11 that the tics start to come out. I mentioned that there's motor tics, and there's also phonic tics. By phonic tics, I mean tics that make a noise, and those can be vocal, using the vocal cords, or other things such as a whistle like that make noise but aren't using the vocal cords. Both motor and phonic tics can be either simple or complex. So if it's a purposeless, meaningless movement that involves just one isolated muscle group, just your arms flying out, for example, that would be considered a simple motor tic. But if you had a number of simple tics all combined together into a ritual where your one arm went out a couple of times and you stamped your foot, shook your head, and blinked your eyes, that would be considered a complex motor tic because it involves a number of motor movements. And the same goes for phonic tics. That, for example, is a simple phonic tic, but there are some complex phonic tics as well that tend to be sensible words or phrases. So a lot of people have heard of the coprolalia, which is the swearing tic. It's not a very common tic. At most, 10 to 30% of people with Tourette's at the most severe end have it, but it's very media-friendly tic, so a lot of people have talked about it. But that would be considered a complex phonic tic, is the swearing. As well, sometimes people with Tourette's experience what's known as echolalia, and that's when you imitate or parrot back what someone else is saying. And that can get you in a lot of trouble if people don't know you have Tourette's syndrome. You can get you beaten up in the schoolyard as you're growing up because people think you're just trying to irritate the other person or get under their skin. And the other type of complex phonic tic that you come across sometimes is something doctors call palilalia, and that means that you imitate your own words. So it might look something like that, where oftentimes tics are done to a feeling of not quite rightness, like it feels like you need to do it again and again until you've satiated this urge, until you've scratched the itch. And sometimes the way a word rolls off your tongue doesn't feel, quote-unquote, just right. And so you need to repeat it a number of times until you're able to move on, until you feel that you've gotten some resolution.
Now, is it the part of the brain that controls speech as well as muscle movement? Is there one part, and this is where the disorder has occurred?
Well, the neurological evidence, there's some that's coming out now that's appearing fairly reliable in the sense it's been replicated and seen a number of times now. But there's still not at a point where they can definitively say Tourette's absolutely is caused by problems in areas such and such. And they're certainly not confident enough in the research yet to be able to say, we just need to scan your brain to look to see if so-and-so area is misfiring and therefore you have Tourette's syndrome. We can diagnose on that basis. But you are correct that some of the speech centers of the brain have been implicated in more recent studies, actually. Largely what's been found time and time again are two areas of the brain. One of them is the frontal lobe, and various areas of the frontal lobe have been implicated. And basically, the frontal lobe is like an orchestra leader for the brain. That it more or less supervises and plans over movements, for example, and executes them. And the frontal lobes also are the locus of what's called executive function. And by executive function, I basically mean your ability to sort of organize and plan yourself, your movements, your thoughts, your actions, long-term goal development and impulse control, so that you can delay gratification, decide, no, doing this right now might feel good right now, but it won't feel good later, and so I'd better hold off on that. That's one of the areas of the brain that's been strongly implicated with Tourette's syndrome. The other area is an area known as the basal ganglia. That's a little deeper down in the brain. It's an older area of the brain, evolutionarily speaking. And basically what the basal ganglia is in charge of is memorizing motor patterns of movement. And so there's connections between the frontal lobe and the basal ganglia such that basically what happens is if I get up and decide I want to walk out the door, the frontal lobe supervises, oversees that, decides, yes, I want to walk to the door, and sends the will down to other areas of the brain, let's go walk to the door. And it's the basal ganglia's job, basically as the reservoir of memorized motor patterns to know what exactly you have to do to walk through the door. And so once the boss upstairs, the frontal lobe, tells you to do it, the basal ganglia actually fires off those motor patterns. And so some research I'm actually doing at the University of Waterloo for my doctorate dissertation is actually in this pathway and what might be going wrong between the frontal lobe and the basal ganglia, so that these tics are coming out as they do in Tourette syndrome.
That sounds like an awfully complicated, brain process, a thought process, and I can't even imagine a 6 or 9-year-old trying to manage it.
It is very frustrating because you're absolutely right. When you're 6 years old, you don't know anything about frontal lobes or executive function. You just know that you've got a devil in your head. You seem to want to do one thing, and your body does another thing. And it's very disturbing in the sense that you feel very out of control. And it's very disturbing in the sense that anything that intuitively comes to mind to do about it doesn't work. In fact, it can often have the opposite effect and make things worse. For example, to go back to that itch analogy I used, remember I mentioned it's like not scratching a mosquito bite, and the more you think about a mosquito bite, the worse it gets. Your best course of action when you've got a mosquito bite is to try and distract yourself away from it. If you're thinking, don't scratch it, don't scratch it, don't scratch it, don't scratch it, the urge is going to grow and grow. So oftentimes these kids, these 6, 7-year-old kids, know they're getting laughed at, know people don't understand them, hate this aspect of themselves, and just want to go away. So they think, don't shake your head, don't shake your head, don't shake your head. It's a logical process for a 6-year-old to take. I don't want to do this, so I'm just going to think about not doing it. But in fact, it can make the urge that much stronger and make it come out 10 times worse. And so then you've got a very depressed child, a child that feels that he's got no power at all over his own body, that there's something up there watching to see what he hates. And as soon as he thinks about how much he hates it, it comes out 10 times worse, and he can feel almost persecuted from the inside.
I have a 6-year-old, and I can't even imagine her going through any of this sort of thought process or trying to deal with something as complex as this. Now, it comes up, it just starts happening around 6 or 9 years old. So you said earlier it might be a delayed genetic gene or a delayed gene. What was that?
Well, again, the genetic research is ongoing. I can say similar things about it as I can about the neurological research. They have hints. They have leads, but they don't have anything definitive enough to say this is absolutely the gene that's causing it. Of course, the ultimate goal is to be able to have a genetic marker so that you could even screen for these things in an unborn child, just to get into the whole genetic counseling area. But in essence, what I can tell you is that there's a consortium, the Tourette Syndrome Association International Consortium for Genetics. And there's 12 sites internationally across the United States. We have one here in Toronto, Canada as well, that are actively looking for the genes involved in Tourette syndrome. It was initially thought some time ago, quite some time ago now, that there may just be one gene, that it would be what they call a dominant gene. And the idea behind a dominant gene is it's basically a one-to-one correlation between having the gene and having the disorder. It's basically this genetic wild card that if you've got it, then you're gonna have Tourette syndrome. More and more, they're realizing that there can't be just one gene. Partly because now that the Genome Project, they've gone all the way through it, they didn't find a single dominant gene. So now they're reevaluating and realizing, okay, there's probably a number of genes, and there's been various theories. Perhaps they're semi-recessive, semi-dominant. Perhaps there's a number of additive genes, such as in schizophrenia, where it's what they call polygenetic inheritance. That basically your risk for having Tourette syndrome increases with each with number of genes that you have. But basically where the genetics are at right now, actually I was in Washington just last weekend hearing the most recent update, chromosomes 4, 8, 11, and 19 seem to hold the best evidence for having some kind of implication with Tourette syndrome. But to use an analogy basically for what that means, if you consider the entire genome, the world, the globe, they've maybe narrowed things down to the continent. but they still have to get down to the country, the province, the city. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but at least they're further along than they were.
Duncan, we need to take another short commercial break here. Please, everyone, stay tuned as we'll continue to find out more about Tourette syndrome after the break. Call us toll-free, 1-866-377-TALK. Email us, yourhealth@essentialtalk.com, or go to the Daily Debate site, click on Your Health, and post your comment or question live. We want to hear from you. Welcome back to Your Health, live on the Essential Talk Network. I'm Pamela Clark, and today we're talking with Duncan McKinley, a director of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada and a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. Duncan, you have Tourette's, and we discussed that earlier, but to date, so far, we've been discussing the symptoms, the genetic links to it or origins of it. How does Tourette manifest itself in you? What symptoms do you have?
Sure. I have a whole number of phonic tics, the tics that make a noise. I've got one that's sort of an outward explosion of air. I call it a bark. It gets bored every once in a while. Right now I have an outie where it's an outward expulsion bark, but every once in a while it swings around and becomes an innie where I pull air in just to keep things interesting and a little spice in my life. I've got a whistle tick that I do, which is quite funny because for years and years growing up I was wanted to be able to whistle like that. And just suddenly one day my neurology figured it out for me. I have a snorting tick. I have a lot of nasal tics where I'm, again, both innies and outies, where I do a lot of sniffing and can make my nose quite sore. I also have a number of different motor tics where they tend, mine, as most people's tend to be, are more upper body. In fact, that's fairly diagnostic of the disorder, and there's some neurological reasons for that as well, why you tend to see them more upper body. But tics tend to start in the facial region, and I know my earliest tics were a lot of excess blinking and winking, and very quickly turned into sort of a mouth extending, where as if you were yawning, except very, very wide, to the point where in the winter, if your skin's quite dry, you can develop a lot of cold sores and rips and tears along the sides of the mouth because you're opening your mouth and extending it so widely, so frequently. I have a number of head shaking tics, to the point where I go to a chiropractor fairly regularly because I was doing a lot of damage to my upper vertebrae and really need to be maintained so that I don't develop arthritis prematurely or anything like that. Other tics I have some arm extending tics. I've got sort of, I've got one lower tic. I've got sort of a butt wiggle that everyone seems to like but me, but kind of glad that's my only lower body tic since, I haven't enjoyed that one too much.
Well, if you do that one, if you do the butt wiggling one in conjunction with a whistle, I'm sure people would be wondering.
and you throw the wink in too, and you really better make sure that there's not a guy looking at you because
you're going to get your face slapped.
Yeah. One thing that's very interesting about tics is that they tend to they aren't completely random. It's not that I just woke up one day and my head was shaking. Tourette syndrome seems to be an expression of extra neurological energy. And if you think of Tourette syndrome as more or less a bored little kid running around in your head without enough to do, but lots of energy and looking for something to do, kind of looking over your shoulder, seeing what you're up to, Tourette syndrome seems to attach itself to certain movements that were at one point in context that you were doing purposefully and had a reason, and they almost get enshrined in a tic movement. So, for example, my head shaking tic started out because I had long bangs. And so I was always shaking my bangs out of my face. And now, that was a very frequent movement. My bangs go out of my face a lot. It was also a very stereotype movement. I tend to shake my head the same way each time to get the bangs out of my face. And those seem to be the two rules that tics follow: frequent movements and stereotype movements. They tend to prey on those. And so, before I knew it, I was moving my head whether my bangs were in my face or not. And now I have very short hair, but it doesn't matter. I'll be forever shaking the imaginary bangs out of my face. There's other examples. The snort that I have actually did start out as a laugh, and I can remember to the evening that we were laughing very, very hard in residence one night, and I started snorting, and that made everyone laugh even harder, and so I was snorting, laughing even more, and the next day it was a tick.
So it just became imprinted?
That's a good word for it. My research that I'm doing at Waterloo basically explains it by saying that a movement such as eye blinking, which I said is a very common tic, the most common tic actually, is something that's done all the time. So that whether I'm walking through a doorway, whether I'm sitting at my desk, whether I'm picking up the phone, whether I'm typing, I'm always blinking. And so I mentioned that one of the areas of the brain that's implicated in Tourette syndrome is one of the areas that memorizes motor movements. And so if this area isn't working quite right, it's memorizing when it shouldn't be all of these incidental movements, these silly movements that aren't important to remember, such as me sitting down at my desk and blinking at the same time. There's no meaningful logical correlation between the two. It just happened. But if this area of the brain is a little bit what they call disinhibited, if it's not very well controlled, then it may memorize too much, and it may let some of these extra movements come out when it shouldn't, so that if I've sat at my desk one day and blinked at the same time, that area of the brain, the basal ganglia, remembers that, and the next day I sit at my desk, basal ganglia goes, oh, when you sit at your desk, you're supposed to blink. And if given enough of those silly little pairings, when I stand up, I'm supposed to blink. When I pick up the phone, I'm supposed to blink. When I sit at my computer, I'm supposed to blink. Eventually, you're going to see me blinking all the time, and it's going to be what we call then a tic. So it's really, if my model's true, I mean, so far the preliminary research has supported it, but that doesn't mean it's definitely true. If it is true, though, basically what tics are the product of millions of silly little learning episodes that we've had that should be inhibited, but aren't.
This leads into one of the postings that we've got, and I'm sorry, I've been fascinated by our conversation that I've been neglecting the postings, so I think we should start addressing some of them right away.
Yeah, sure.
There's one from Nick, and he says, when someone has a vocal tic, why are they saying swear words? Why do some people say particular words and others say others? And are the words they use learned somehow?
Okay. I think we've certainly talked about the learning aspect of Tourette syndrome a little bit, that he's right by mentioning that Tourette's is sort of a unique interplay between the neurology, the hardware, and the learning environment, the software, so that while I'm born and my brain is predisposed to get stuck on something, what those somethings are going to be very dependent on what environment I'm in. And so, to be very facetious for a moment, if I grew up in a monastery and didn't have cable television and had never heard a swear word in my life, I couldn't possibly have coprolalia simply because I'd never been exposed to those particular words to get stuck on. Now, the other part of the next question was why swear words? Like, why these awful words? Well, it's sort of like, I remember one time hearing a stand-up comedian talk about the weird little impulses we get, and it made me realize that it wasn't just people with Tourette's, it's just that we acted on them, where other people maybe didn't. You'll go into a situation, and the worst possible thing that could happen, the worst possible thing you could do or say will pop into your mind, and it just seems to... it seems to be human nature where you think, oh, can you imagine if I did this? And you quickly think, oh, that'd be awful. One example might be you walk into a room where a fan's going, and you kind of think in the back of your head, gee, what would happen if I stuck my finger in the fan? And if you're properly inhibited, if your brakes work well, you're not actually going to do it. But these awful things that cause all sorts of embarrassment or are scary or a lot of emotion. They're very arousing in that sense, that you think, oh, geez, wouldn't that be awful? Those are the exact things that the Tourette's is going to prey on, because stress makes Tourette symptoms worse. And so, in a sense, if you're at grandma's house and it pops into your head just like it would pop into anyone else's head, oh, be careful not to swear here because I'll get in a lot of trouble. Grandma will faint and my parents won't take me to Disney World next week like we're supposed to, and on and on. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of stimulation around that thought. And simply because of that, that's going to fuel the Tourette syndrome. so as soon as you've thought it, all of a sudden that itch is going to start to build. Oh yeah, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. The itch is getting worse and worse and worse, and before you know it, you're doing the exact thing that you knew you weren't supposed to do and would be the worst possible thing to do in that situation. I know different times I've done presentations, I've had people come up to me, they're just mortified that their child has the swearing tick because the good Christians, they go to church every week. I mean, it seems like it seems very ironic that people that have such an emphasis on not swearing and being polite and such have a child with a swearing tick. And in fact, that's exactly probably why they're seeing the swearing tick, because there's such an emphasis on not doing it. There's a lot of stress around it, and that elicits it.
So it's almost like a truth serum, it seems.
I often call very, very perceptive. I often call Tourette syndrome and these other disorders that go along with it sort of disorders of honesty. That really, I don't feel different things from other people. I don't think different things. I don't process things in different ways. I simply have less breaks over what I do. And so my movements, my thoughts, my impulses, my emotions, they're just a little bit closer to the surface. It's like there's a neurological microphone being held up to them. And so you've probably heard the saying before that you wear your emotions on your sleeve. In a very real sense, people with Tourette syndrome wear their movements on their sleeve, and their sort of impulses, their thoughts about movements. Like you might be really thirsty and be walking by someone who's got a big cold glass of whatever it is you want to drink, and somewhere in your mind, whether it's conscious or not, you're going to think, oh, geez, I should just grab that and drink it. And of course, when your supervisor is working well and you're well inhibited and your brakes are working, that area of your brain, the frontal lobe, can go, no, don't grab that person's drink, you'll get arrested, and you just move on, often without even being aware that you considered the option. But when you've got Tourette syndrome, your arm may reach out, you may touch the drink or lunge for it. So in a sense, yeah, I was thinking the same thing as everyone else, it's just that I acted on it. And if you add in the other disorders, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, and these various learning disabilities and different conditions that go along with Tourette syndrome, basically what you've got are brakes not working in other directions. So that just like I don't have very good brakes on my movements, I don't have very good brakes on my thoughts, that I'll get stuck on thoughts that will reverberate over and over and over in my head because I can't turn them off, just like I can't turn off my movements. And when you can't turn your thoughts off, that's what they call the obsessive-compulsive disorder. And so it's not that I'm thinking anything different from anyone else, it's just that I have less control over when I think about what and for how long. The same can be said for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, where now what I don't have very good control over is what I pay attention to and for how long. And
Duncan,
yeah.
We need to take another short commercial break here, but we'll be right back with more on Tourette syndrome. Please, everyone, stay tuned. Call us toll-free, 1-866-377-8255, or go to the Daily Debate site and post your comments live. We've got some more that we'll address right after the break. You're listening to Your Health. I'm Pamela Clark, and our guest today is the Director of Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada, Duncan McKinley. Duncan, before we go to the numerous postings that are up on the website, I'd just like to say I'd like to nominate you as a Member of Parliament. I think we could use a lot more honesty in politics, and this seems to... what do you think? This would be a great platform. I promise, honesty. I can't help it.
Well, I'll tell you. I tend to meet different types of people, and some people very much relish my honesty, and some people are a little bit scared of it. I think that I've been told before, actually, that one of the reasons I make people uncomfortable is because I tend to remind them about things about themselves they'd rather not think about. Because I don't have the ability to kind of hide the little uglies, to shove them off in a corner behind some neurological barriers that I can avoid different things about myself. It all comes out, and I'm talking about it all, I'm dealing with it all, and that can make other people that feel similarly but don't want to think about it very uncomfortable.
Well, you must have some interesting first dates there.
When they get them.
Oh, okay. Now to the postings. We've got to get back to business. We've got one from Jane in Victoria. Is there a medication that you can take for Tourette's?
There are a whole number of medications. Now, there's a number of things I can say generally about medications. Because I'm going through for my PhD, I will be a doctor, but I'll be a doctor of psychology. I'll be a psychologist rather than a medical doctor, and so you'd want to go to a psychiatrist or a neurologist to actually get medications prescribed and such. But what I can say generally about medications is there's a whole whack of them, for one thing, and there's not a tailor-made medication for Tourette syndrome. That they've really sort of begged and borrowed from a number of different disciplines, and part of the reason for that is, as I alluded to before break, there's a lot of different disorders that go along with Tourette syndrome, and so you almost need to develop somewhat of a medical cocktail to have numerous lines of offense against the various symptoms. For the tics themselves, basically what are used are neuroleptics or atypical antipsychotics. Basically, these drugs are borrowed from the field of schizophrenia, and they're called dopamine antagonists. And what that means is that dopamine is a chemical in the brain that basically is involved in movement. And to be very, very simplistic with the neurology, basically if you've got too much dopamine, you've got too much movement. And that's the basic premise behind these dopamine antagonists, that, well, hey, if we shore up some of this dopamine, if we take some of this dopamine away, we'll get rid of some of this excess movement. And there are a number of side effects that go along with any drugs, of course, and the antipsychotics in particular, while they can work fairly effectively in quite a few people, a lot of people discontinue them because they don't like the side effects. But as the field progresses, there's more and more drugs that are available. For the other areas, for the obsessive compulsive disorder, they tend to use the same drugs that they use with depression. Actually, they're called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they target, rather than dopamine, which I said was sort of the movement chemical, they target a chemical in the brain called serotonin, which is, again, being simplistic, a mood chemical in the brain. And so just like they help increase serotonin with depression so that your mood elevates, the same drugs seem to help with the intrusive thoughts and the compulsions with obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a number of different drugs also for Tourette syndrome, things like antihypertensives. There's a drug called clonidine out there that can be of use. Some people try benzodiazepines, which basically help with anxiety, things like Valium, because, as I mentioned, stress makes tics worse, and so if you can find different ways of decreasing stress, that can help. I could go on and on about medications. There are quite a few out there, and it's basically a game of trying various medications, seeing if they work, if they don't, trying something else, and also getting the right mixture of medications. Sometimes when a few different medications interact, they come up with there's an emergent effect. There's some sort of side effect or some sort of aspect that comes up as a result of the two medications combined. And so if that's not anything you can live with, then you have to try a different combination of drugs. So don't expect to be able to find the perfect medication right away. In fact, don't expect to find perfect medication. Expect to find some things out there that may help ameliorate the worst symptoms and the things that are on your priority list of the things you want to get rid of first and foremost. And you may also want to try a number of different psychological techniques, behavioral and cognitive strategies that a psychologist can help you with, along with the various medications for treatment. For example, there's something known as habit reversal training, which has been shown to be, it's a behavioral technique, and it's something that's been shown to be very effective in dealing with tic symptoms.
What about something that just sort of numbs that part of the brain? Is that how it would work?
Part of the problem is, and this comes up with the original medications I mentioned, the neuroleptics and the antipsychotics, is that you can get into the point where you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. this is probably something I'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow when I'm wearing more of my personal hat rather than my research hat.
Right.
But there can be a number of positive aspects of Tourette syndrome that you really relish. And if you sort of numb everything, you may have gotten rid of the tics, but you've gotten rid of everything else too. And so it becomes a choice. Gee, do I want to be a strange person, or do I want to be half a person? And so there's a term that a lot of folks throw around in the Tourette's community that they call zombie effect, and it's basically when you're over medicated, when you've got too high of a dosage, and your tics are gone, but so is everything else, and you're walking around. Well, when you're not sleeping, that is, you may sleep 16 hours a day, but you're walking around in a real fugue, and so that's something that doctors are very aware of, and there's a lot of very good doctors out there now that recognize, geez, don't start too high and work your way down. Don't try and get rid of everything. Start low and slowly work your way up so that you don't wipe the person out along with the disorder.
Okay. We're going to take another short break now before we wrap up today's program. Call us now if you have any questions about Tourette syndrome. That's toll-free, 1-866-377-8255. We'll be right back with more of Your Health. We're back to the final segment of Your Health, broadcast live on the Essential Talk Network. I'm your host, Pamela Clark, and our guest is Duncan McKinley, Director of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada. Duncan, we've got time for just a few more questions, and we've got so many postings, so I think we'll have to save most of them for tomorrow.
No problem.
One of the ones at the top is from Anonymous. What percentage of people get Tourette's? And Duncan was mentioning that earlier in the show that currently I think it's maximum 3% of the population would have Tourette's.
Some people are going that high. The official stance of the foundation right now is half of 1%, 1 in 200.
Okay, half of 1%. And the person, Anonymous, says get Tourette's. Now, getting implies that it might be contagious, but I think it's just hereditary. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay.
Again, the genes aren't exactly understood right now, but one theory that's out there that has a fair bit of support is the idea that mom will have one gene and dad will have one gene. And these genes are what they call 50% penetrant. And this is just a theory, mind you, but it seems to fit the available facts well. And by 50% penetrant, what I mean is that half the time, 50% of the time, the parent might show some symptoms, like a little bit of distractibility, a little bit of a nervous habit, getting stuck on things a little bit, but they wouldn't have full-blown Tourette's. And for the person, for their child to have Tourette's syndrome, they both have to pass on the genes. And so in the person with Tourette's, they would be what they call homozygous, so they would have both of these genes together.
Okay, and Margaret from Regina, her question was, is Tourette's an inherited affliction? And the answer would be definitely yes.
Yeah.
From June, quickly, does someone with Tourette's always have the same symptoms, or do their individual symptoms change with time?
That's a very good question, and yes, they do change with time. I've got that tic right now. It's sort of almost a laugh tic, and I've just developed it in the last week or so. I seem to have certain symptoms that have become more or less a permanent repertoire that at this point they're like old friends, and I go off on a road trip for a little while, and I might not see them for a while, but then they'll come back again and see how I'm doing and head off again. And they'll do what's called in clinical literature wax and wane. They'll a certain symptom will increase for a while and then maybe decrease again. But she's absolutely right that different, completely different, totally new symptoms can appear throughout life. And because I mentioned there's a learning component to Tourette syndrome, you may have started a new job that, like for example, I noticed when I had very motoric jobs, summer jobs, I had a lot of motor tics. But as soon as I became a graduate student and started doing a lot of verbal presenting and such, my vocal tics took over. So if I decided next week to go, join a shipyard or something, but my tics would probably change again based on the experiences, the motor experiences I was having there.
Well, if you join a shipyard, you'd probably end up swearing a bit more.
Yeah, I thought you were very brave, by the way, to have someone who's, one of the symptoms of his disorder is, sudden involuntary swearing on a live TV or on a live radio program.
Oh, that's fine. And, just I can't do it. See,
I've had people
I might think it, Duncan, but I'm not allowed to say it.
I've had people come up to me before with $20 in a script and point at a person and say, "Come on, man, please, you'd get away with it." No. Not going to use my disorder. There's a couple things I want to mention quickly if I've got a minute.
You've got 1 minute, and then we're going to have to hold everything for tomorrow's show.
Okay. Well, I wanted to make mention about the nicotine research that's very big right now, and I also wanted to make mention about the strep throat research that's very big right now. So maybe I can hold both of those for tomorrow.
Duncan, you're going to have to save them tomorrow, and we've also got lots of postings we didn't address. We'll address them on tomorrow's show, Part 2, or The Bride of Tourette Syndrome, I guess we could call it. I don't know. Duncan McKinley, a director of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada. It's been a wonderful show. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
We'll see you tomorrow, Duncan.
Take care.
I'm Pamela Clark, host of Your Health.
Take your vitamins, get plenty of exercise, sleep well, and you'll be healthy. But your body's health is so much more than just physical. Staying informed, being happy, and keeping a positive frame of mind are equally important. Pamela Clark is here to keep you up to date about your health, well-being, and staying healthy in the new millennium. 1-866-377-TALK is the number to call to ask questions and exercise your brain. Pamela Clark cares about your health right here on the Essential Talk Network.
Hello, I'm Pamela Clark. Welcome to another edition of Your Health, broadcast exclusively on the Essential Talk Network. Today's subject is living with Tourette syndrome. Yesterday's show was all about the medical side, or the scientific side, I guess we could say, of Tourette syndrome, which is a neurological or neurochemical disorder which is characterized by tics. Now, they're involuntary, rapid, sudden movements, or vocalizations that occur repeatedly in the same way. Our guest yesterday was Duncan McKinley, a director of the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada, and we're very privileged to have Duncan back again today to talk about what it's like to live with Tourette syndrome. He was diagnosed at the age of 19, although he says he knew it was a secret by age 7. Sorry there, Duncan, I was mixing up the intro there.
Not a problem.
Welcome back, Duncan.
I couldn't be happier to be back. You just mentioned how I got diagnosed when I was at 19. I actually got diagnosed very serendipitously through an Ann Landers newspaper article. And I'll tell you, it was the most pivotal moment of my life where, for years and years and years I had been pretending this wasn't going on and feeling socially ostracized, just completely alone and like the biggest freak in the world. And I'll tell you, my life changed forever for the better the day I heard the words Tourette syndrome. And I'm so excited and privileged to be on this show, not once but twice, to be able to hopefully help someone else have that same sort of experience where maybe they don't know what's going on and they just happen to be lucky enough to be tuned into your radio show today.
Well, Duncan, we've got so many postings that we didn't address yesterday, so that we've got to get to work today. We've got a lot of things to cover. But Ann Landers, so Ann Landers saved the day. How was that?
That was just phenomenal. Actually, there's quite a few media folks out there that really deserve a lot of kudos. I know Ann Landers, she at least once a year has an article on Tourette syndrome, just simply because she has such an astounding response every time she mentions anything about Tourette syndrome. So it's just become a regular thing for her. As well, the talk show host on television, Maury Povich, he now regularly does an annual Tourette syndrome show because of the people that just come out of the woodwork every time he raises a little bit more awareness. And he, I know, recently won I believe it was an Educators or a Public Awareness Award from the Tourette Syndrome Association, which is the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada's, partner in raising awareness down south of the border.
That's fabulous. It's coming. More information is getting out there. I see that more and more people are interested in it, which, right through all of the postings, Duncan, we missed about 7 or 8 yesterday. That's embarrassing, directing the interviews directly to that.
Well, it's hard to get me to shut up, so understood.
Oh, no. I'll just jump right in. Okay.
Yep.
One from Margaret from Regina. Is Tourette syndrome an affliction? Now, I think we covered most of that yesterday, but if you want to briefly sum it.
Sure. They don't understand the genetics exactly. As I mentioned yesterday, they have some hints. They basically they understand that bones that may be for Tourette syndrome 8, 11, and 19 are the best bar. in essence, to summarize what they believe is that there's probably a number of different genes. They may combine in sort of an additive sense. You maybe show some of the associated problems with Tourette syndrome, some emotional management problems, some stuck obsessing rumination problems, where when you've got two or perhaps even more, they're not sure, as I say, it's just a model, then the full-blown Tourette syndrome comes out. So long-time moms got a bad rap. They said it's the dominant gene and it's all your fault. But they seem to have moved beyond that now, and as I say, some of the more current models suggest, well, you get sides of the family, and certainly I can see that in my own family anecdotally, and the pedigree analyses, which is basically where genetic researchers go back into the family tree and to the family, but that seems to support this model as well.
And if you have Tourette syndrome, what is the chance of having a child?
Well, again, the exact genetics, they're not going to be able to say that for sure. Based on the model that I think follows the current evidence, so far a model by a fellow by the name of Cummings, who's a medical doctor down in California. Based on his model, you would expect there's about a 50-50 chance of passing. So mom would have to have the gene, dad would have to have the gene, and they would each have a chance of passing on the gene. So based on that, you've got a 25% probability that you'll get both. You've got a 50% probability that you and from either mom or dad, and the probability that you won't get any of the genes. So I guess if I done the math right quickly in my head, you've got about a half and half chance of showing something, whether it's a lesser problem than Tourette's or not, and there's a chance, 1 in 4 chance of showing the full-blown Tourette's. Parents are carrying the gene.
So both parents would have to have it. But then again, if neither of your parents have it, trace root of this seems to be quite a puzzle.
It definitely is, because what complicates things is that a person can carry one gene, so says the model anyway, and not necessarily show it. For example, in my family, assumedly both carry the gene. However, you have to look beyond my father to see evidence of the gene. My mom, she has a lot in common, and I think our relationship has improved a bit more, but to understand a little bit more why we were clashing so much. I think we had a lot of similar skin.
Well, that sounds like a typical parent, child or teenager relationship.
Oh, for sure.
Do you think your mom displayed symptoms of Tourette?
Not of the full-blown Tourette. As I mentioned, when one of the genes show, not the full-blown case, but in my mother, she's certainly quite a few obsessions and compulsions, and a lot of the and such. Again, nothing that's diagnosable. It's what we call subclinical. It gives me clues to where I came from.
Well, any indication that it's increasing of how it begins, and maybe for other kids too, they can recognize certain things, or parents would recognize certain things in themselves.
Oh, for sure. I think one of the real advantages, actually, of having Tourette syndrome, you can look at it very negativistically and say, well, a lot of people have disorders, a lot of people have pebbles in their shoes, but they can hide them, and mine's out there for the whole world to see and judge and ridicule. But you can swing that around also and say, boy, do I have an opportunity, because a lot of people can be pretty good at hiding from their negatives. The little uglies that they don't like about themselves, they can avoid. And in which case, they continue to trip you up continuously throughout your life because you're not dealing with them. I think one of the real positives and advantages of Tourette syndrome is that I can't ignore it. It's wrapped up and tied with a bow and shoved in my face daily. And so I really have no other choice but to confront a lot of things about myself. And while that's a lot of work, that's a lot of things that maybe a lot of other people growing up don't have to address, boy, can it have a lot of strengths to it, because I think that I'm at a point now of self-acceptance about myself, self-awareness, that a lot of people maybe take a lot more years than I have to get to, because I really had no other choice but to deal with it.
Your testimony to the power of positive thinking, Duncan, it's amazing, I've just heard from our producer that we've got Kelly Haynes on the line as well. Kelly, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hi.
I'd like to...
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. Long time no speak.
Yes.
I'll introduce the two of you. Obviously, they know each other. Kelly Haynes is a 32-year-old ventriloquist and an actor who has Tourette syndrome. Kelly is also working with Duncan on the www.tourette.ca. That's the website for the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada. We're going to take a short commercial break here, but please, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of your help and what it's like to live with Tourette syndrome. If you have a comment or question, call us toll-free, 1-866-377-8255, or go to the Daily Debate site, and we promise we'll get to your posting today. We'll be right back with more on your health. Welcome back to Your Health. I'm Pamela Clark, and today we're talking about Tourette syndrome, what it's like to live with the disorder. We've got on the line Duncan McKinley, who was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at age 19, and Kelly Haynes. Kelly, when were you diagnosed with Tourette syndrome?
I was actually diagnosed at 15 years of age after 6 months in the hospital. So that was in the early 80s. So 15 I was diagnosed.
15 and 19, and yet, did you know that Duncan says he knew he had a secret from the age of 7? So that was, 12 years?
Yeah, I certainly did know. It was to the point where I wasn't going to school, and I was in the backyard just flailing my arms and having to do repetitive things. So it was like a secret, too, that I didn't want to talk about. And from there, I was, ended up missing a year. No one really knew why. Lived in a small town with a lot of, and then ended up in the hospital. I think it was after about 4 months they said, we think your daughter has Tourette syndrome. And then from there, after many medications and so forth, and therapy, I started to something maybe into what I felt. It definitely, and so did my parents.
One of the reasons that Kelly and I are both so passionate about helping youngsters with Tourette syndrome, Kelly through her pup writing and the book that I'm writing, presentations and such, is because both of us are very aware from being that one of the most difficult things about dealing with Tourette syndrome when you was late is not the sense of what you thought about yourself and how the world treated you. And for so long, we both really recognized the power of just simply early intervention and getting lots of education and positive attitude going. It can circumnavigate so many problems.
Right, and if I can say, the thing is, having Tourette, well, okay, that's difficult, but being teased or not going to school and being thought of as a person, that's the hardest thing, because everybody wants to belong, and if we can, like Duncan says, I worked with him before too, which was wonderful, had the opportunity to Duncan. But it was really we understand what it's like to be teased, and here we are now, and let's do something about it, and let's look at the strengths that we have, positive things, and the talent, and
I know myself that when I was growing up, particularly the teenage years, I couldn't have been lower. I mean, of whether I was going to kill myself, it was a matter of when and how, and really, I derived no pleasure out of living whatsoever, and wanted life to be over with. And from going as then to where I am now, it really fueled a lot of my I'm nothing special. I can do it. They can do it. A person, far an attitude to swing so 180, then I can't think of anything more tangible I could do in my life than help other people get a little quicker than I did.
Yeah, and you get so much out of it from whether it's doing my ventriloquism in front of kids and being nervous ahead of time, and these educational shows. A couple actually came up and said, "Are you okay? You know, are you nervous?" They had Tourette's too, and they were saying, "You know, just believe in yourself. You can do it." And I find that a lot of times when I go to counselors, old souls, you know. So yeah, I Duncan there.
Yesterday, Kelly, I went to the website after we spoke, and I looked up some of the emails, and they are heartbreaking, and I'd just like to read one out to our listeners. It says, "Hello, Kelly and pals," and that's her puppet. "Sometimes I find it really hard to cope with my TF. Sometimes I want my mom to cut off my foot or my hand because of my most annoying tics that stop my life completely. My name is Allison, and I'm 10 years old." It was staggering, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, this is so much, I guess, self-loathing. How can you help a child cope with it?
You can just turn it around and you can say, "Hey, well, I talked to Camilla, my frog, and Puppet, and McGraw, my bird." Duncan knows them very well, actually. They quite like Duncan. And we say, "Okay, what can we do?" And we talk about the things of how it feels like you want to just get rid of that body part because it's so, anxiety is so high. You turn it around and say, you know, hang in there, and there's hope, and there's let it tunnel, and even though I can say it now and then, you know, when my husband is here and I come through the door and I just explode and kept everything inside for so long, you just look at it forward, and if you can just say, "Hey, you're not going crazy, there is going to be, you just got, and boy, are you ever going to be a strong grown-up person or a strong teenager through that going crazy." I think the big thing is when you're having this terrible feeling and stuff going around inside, if you can just be told, "Look, in past, you're in the right place, don't be afraid," and definitely just please give that kind of advice, and also say, "Hey, I understand what it feels like to have so much that you just don't want to be here anymore." So I was sticking with the positive and saying, "Hang in there, you're not alone, and please don't, when you feel, just know that you're not alone, and you can get through it." It's kind of like a coach.
I think that actually what Kelly just made there at the end was a really good point about sticking with the positive. But I think what I didn't recognize, and it took me some time to realize, is that yesterday I was talking about Tourette's syndrome as sort of an amplification of self. Basically, like, not working that well, the sensors aren't working that well, a little bit quicker and bigger. And so many people are diagnosing and looking at the symptoms and trying to come up with treatment. So many people are focusing so intently on the negative aspects of being disinhibited that they forget completely about the whole other side of the picture, the positive aspects. There are doctors, there are actors like Kelly, there are sports, there are lawyers, there are teachers, there are artists, there are all sorts of people that are succeeding, not in spite of their Tourette's, but because of the disinhibition, those help them to become extraordinarily smart or talented or creative. And when you learn to tap as well and channel the energy into the positive, constructive stuff, you start to recognize, hey, Tourette's isn't necessarily about the quality of yourself, and you can either focus on the good or focus on the bad, just like in yourself.
But Duncan, how did you go from a teenager to this self-confident, very articulate, very positive?
Oh, thank you.
I'm out of words. It's like that is such a leap. And what, in less than, you're 27 years old, I think you said?
turned 27 last weekend, yeah, so I've been diagnosed with 8 years now. Well, so one thing, look at that, that's 8 years. It didn't happen quickly, it didn't happen overnight. Real change never does. I think that there's a number of things I can point to. First, education. The more you understand that gets better in a number of ways. For one, you no longer analyze as much. You no longer think, I'm a bad, awful person, and you internalize every time someone laughs at you or doesn't understand you, or you have a hard time getting good grade or what have you. Because not that you have it shouldn't be used as an excuse, but you have an explanation. You realize, okay, I'm not a bad person. I'm actually a very good, really tough, overwhelming problems, and that can really salvage your self-esteem. I think the other reason education is good is because it can bring control back to your life. For example, something that has, stress makes my Tourette's worse. So that'll make my Tourette's worse. It's still going to, but you can, and being able to predict the situation, avoid going into that room full of busy people if you don't feel like having your Tourette's go haywire, can be a really powerful thing. Another very important piece of parents use as an excuse that, in retrospect, my mom has said to me before, well, it's glad we know now, but, we think that, had we known back then, we get away with it. And I had parents that wanted to help, willing to compromise on the means to which I did things, but they weren't willing to compromise on the ends. They weren't willing to let me cop out and say, okay, you don't have to do this, and we'll let you get away with this because you're having difficulty with it. They basically had, no, you still have to. Well, you may have to do it a little bit different. We'll have done it. We'll find a way, and so I study and work in a very different way. My means are different, but my ends are the same. For the longest time, I ran from the foot, attitude-wise, because I didn't understand what I had, and so, if people find out, I'm not going to like me anymore, and I won't have any friends, and no one will want, etc. And so I really self-fulfilled anyone. In essence, I never gave anyone opportunity to show that they understanding. Because when I didn't tell them what was going on, of course they didn't understand, and so then I go, see, I told you they wouldn't like me. And starting to give some friends the opportunity to understand really blew me away. I really stood up for me and had a laugh about it. And I had said, you know what, we're a lot more comfortable with your Tourette's than you are. And the only time we get uncomfortable about it, comfortable by apologizing for it so much and looking so embarrassed about it. And so what I allowed myself really to have fun, boy did they ever. I think there's a whole other number of things I could point to. Also, just make a haven. I mean, I recognize that I've got all this energy and opportunity to recharge, and if I don't give myself good off, my strategies will fall apart. And so, kids, if you're living at home, you have your room for your own. That no one can come in if they knock first, and have your room. That's okay. If you want to have a thing like a bomb just hit, well, so be it, because it's just really important when we live in such an internal chaotic world to have one little place that is all our own. We know no one will intrude on, control us so little in days to days. I think humor is absolutely vital, but I think I heard someone say something.
Yes, I need to interrupt right here. Please, everyone, stay tuned, and we'll continue to find out more about what it's like to live with Tourette syndrome after the break. Call us toll-free, 1-866-377-TALK, or go to the Daily Debate site, click on your health section. We've got to address those postings after the break, you guys. We've got a lot of questions out there from the listeners. We'll be right back with more. You're listening to Your Health live on the Essential Talk Network. I'm Pamela Clark, and today we're talking with Duncan McKinley and Kelly Haynes, people that work with the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada and both are Tourette. Duncan, you wanted to talk about the nicotine patch. Now, I was doing some reading about that, and this is the first good usage of nicotine that I've ever heard of.
Certainly. I guess to summarize, good drug, too bad about the delivery, because people are, your nicotine can help Tourette syndrome, and so you guys take up smoking. And so I thought I should probably take a second just to insert so that people know that actually smoking isn't different. Basically, the idea of what's happening with the nicotine can catalyze the benefits of others, and what I mean by that is that it'll just make the other work a little bit more effectively. Nicotine, it emulates one of the chemicals in the brain called acetylcholine, and I guess to keep it simple, basically acetylcholine causes more dopamine to be produced, and so if nicotine is masquerading as a choline, and then the brain's going to be tricked into making even more dopamine. Now, yesterday I mentioned how the more dopamine you have, the more simplistically anyway, think, well, this seems kind of backwards, how come nicotine works? The idea is if you have a nicotine patch and you're having this continuous over-flooding, influx of nicotine, eventually those receptors will be producing more dopamine, but they won't be able to keep up. And eventually they'll overload, and you'll produce dopamine. So that's one of the reasons why smoking doesn't really make much of a difference, because for it to be at all effective, you need a pretty much continuous flow of nicotine, and smoking doesn't into the brain nearly that effectively. And the problem actually, even with patch, is that at least 70% of people have pretty extreme as a side effect from using the patch. And so basically what nicotine is that, it does seem to have some benefit, but what they now is finding ways of manufacturing new pharmaceutical drugs that will inject the nicotine, but will eliminate all the negative aspects of nicotine. So there's a drug by the name of ABT, for example. There's another drug called mecamyelin that is researched right now so that people don't think they should go out and start smoking to be that effective, and it's just going to cause all the problems that come along with smoking, on top.
Okay, but there is possibility that nicotine will enhance the abilities of drugs to treat Tourette syndrome.
Exactly, but it maybe doesn't necessarily have to be nicotine. What we need is is it about nicotine? Drugs work better, and let's produce it in mass quantities without using nicotine itself, because nicotine can have a lot of bad side effects. The other thing that I just wanted to mention briefly is, we're curious about PANDAS. PANDAS it stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcal Infections. That's the big doctor babble. Basically what PANDAS is the idea that it might trigger Tourette syndrome.
Article in the medicine with Tourette's or obsessive compulsive.
Exactly. And basically what the thinking is with this is really it's a genetic inheritance. But in this case, what they think the genetic load is that person, when they are infected with a strep throat, a streptococcus, the antibodies that they produce, the group alpha beta the antibodies that are response to that, not only attack the infection, attack areas of the brain. I was talking about the basal ganglia yesterday. It's one of the areas thought to motor patterns of movement. Mm-hmm. What happens is these then attack the brain and either bind to that area of the brain or perhaps even destroy the tissue to cause then the problems that are inherent in Tourette syndrome. A lot of people then, what they want to do then is, which is plasma transfer, or intravenous immune globulin, EIG is called. And these are very extensive sort of serious invasive techniques, are done on the basic premise that, well, if it's awful floating around in our blood, we need to get rid of them. We need to get rid of the plasma all the way up to the brain and the brain. Now, good logic, there's not enough research yet to know whether this TANDIS even exists. It's still really in the preliminary stages, and what they're finding is that some people have these antibodies floating around, and other people have Tourette syndrome, but they don't have these antibodies floating around. And they're also finding that the level of antibodies doesn't equal to, like, if you've got a ton of these antibodies, you'd expect a ton of tics, and if you've got a few of these antibodies, you'd expect a few tics. And that's not panning out. Lots and lots of questions about whether this whole strep throat-triggered Tourette syndrome even exists. So it's basically the National Institute of Mental Health and the Tourette syndrome have joined a quote that says that research in the pandas is still very experimental, and there's no evidence of benefits, given that the treatments that are so serious. You're in a research trial. Because it's entirely possible, some people have suggested, that all that's happening is that when you've got sick, and when you're sick, that's stressful. And I mentioned yesterday that stress makes, so maybe all you're seeing is what doctors call a which means that any time you're stressed, your tics are going to be worse, and strep throat is just happens to be one of those times. There's also all sorts of different reports are coming up now, not only about the strep throat, but some people are wondering viruses could be causing Tourette syndrome. I mentioned pandas. There's another thing called PITHAN, which is pediatric infection-triggered autoimmune neurosignators. People now doing some research, perhaps that Lyme disease presents as Tourette syndrome. So there's a whole whack of stuff that is not confirmed by any means yet. It could be pretty dangerous to engage in any treatments, assuming that this stuff is true. So I just make sure I address that right now, and they shouldn't all go for plasma exchange or just take up smoking next week.
No, very excellent summary, but if I might sum it up in one sentence, they don't have any clue, do they?
They've got clues, they just don't have.
Okay, well, that was an awful lot of theories, and it was like they're coming from all of it, and it's just like, well, I think there's still a long ways to go before they find out what makes it tick.
Well, that's the impression that there's nothing definite.
Okay. Now, Duncan, I'm going to put you to work, and we've got to answer.
I promise I will now. Nothing else but...
Okay. Kelly, you're more than at any time, too, and help us get through these postings. We've got a second one from Rob. He posted one yesterday. Rob from Vancouver, and he put a similar one up again today. Today he says, I've got a couple of questions. I noticed on the show yesterday that you actually did some of the noises and tics while having them. Was that intentional, or is it possible there's a connection between thinking about an individual and it happening? For example, when you spoke about the risk.
Absolutely. And sometimes I am just consciously in it, but also, as I mentioned yesterday, it's very much like an itch. The more you think about don't itch your, left arm, don't itch your left arm, the more and more your left arm's screaming at you. And so if I'm thinking specifically about particular, that's going to, in a sense, fuel that tic to occur. Once I had a tic that was very annoying, and the irony about Tourette syndrome is for you can't realize you've lost it. Think about the fact that you've lost that tic, and it's back, that I'd forgotten about for a couple of days. And I had a roommate, very well-intentioned roommate, who was comfortable talking to me about my Tourette syndrome, said, "Hey, congratulations, that tic you really hate, you finally got rid of." And I just launched across the room at his throat because, of course, the tic was immediately back. The other thing that some of your listeners may have noticed, too, is that when I'm yapping on, I don't tend to tick much. But as soon as I stop to listen to a question or for a commercial break, I tend to tick quite a bit. That is because, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you can really channel a lot of this energy into a lot of positive stuff. But they mentioned it's almost like this extra neurological energy that needs a release valve. It needs to be, it's unbraked, it's uncensored, and it just needs to come out. And that's really the only rule of the game. As long as it comes out, you're happy and your Tourette's is happy. And so the more and more constructive ways you can put this energy into, the better you're both going to be. And so when I'm doing my presentation, when I'm on a radio show and I'm watching the time and you know, glancing at my notes and thinking about what I'm going to say next, that's a very disinhibited task. And that takes a lot of simultaneous major demands on my brain all at the same time. And so it's not that I'm suppressing the tics when I'm doing all this talking. It's just that any energy that might be left over that would go into tics isn't left over. It's all being utilized into this massive task that I'm doing. And so, in a sense, I'm starving the tics for fuel.
Is that the same for you, Kelly? So I'm jumping in here.
Right, no, well, my tics were so severe that I couldn't stay in a room with a bunch of people without just letting go. Now what I do is a little different. I get thoughts behind the tics, so I'll get say a bad thought, or I'll see something that it makes me uncomfortable, and I'll punch the air. Now, I might not be ticking now, but when I get off the phone, I'll have a good little tick there. And
that's exactly my point.
Yeah,
you're very busy right now, and so it's using the energy up. Dr. Doran, he's a medical doctor that's out in B.C., and he finds when he does surgery, he doesn't tick. There's an artist by the name of Michael Wolf who plays jazz piano, and he talks about how his tick is channeled into the musical stream, that he doesn't tick when he's playing music. And so, yeah, sort of like you just said, when you're doing the radio show, you don't tick very much. A lot of people find that.
Yeah, and
sorry, we need to go to a short commercial break here, but we'll be right back with more on what it's like to live with Tourette's right after the break. You're listening to Your Health. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to Your Health. Mark and our guests today are Kelly Haynes and Duncan McKinley, both of whom work with the Film Foundation of Canada. Kelly or Duncan, just another question from Rob in Vancouver. Did his character in Rain Man Tourette's? It was autism, wasn't it?
Had autism, is that?
autism.
Now, a lot of connection between autism and Tourette's and the research in that area, but pervasive developmental disorders, of which autism and Asperger's will fit in there, about 6.5% with pervasive developmental disorders will have Tourette's syndrome. Hello?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm done.
No.
It was a short response.
I'm sorry, you caught me off guard. There, Duncan, that wasn't very short.
No, just kidding. Duncan, that things in that are understandable, and that's another thing. Just to stay on topic, but get off topic, is that when you hear him speak to the kids, even so that the kids can understand, and sometimes the doctor terms are a little hard to understand. Put it right there where it needs to.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a very nice compliment. I work very hard to do that because I think that I've got a real advantage having the Tourette's in the field that I'm in. That I think that doctors and people with Tourette's can know a lot about Tourette's, but boy, if you put the two together, it can be a powerful.
It certainly is, and for the both of you to be working with children is fabulous contribution. In fact, Rob from Vancouver concludes his posting by saying, "Great topic at Duncan for having the strength and openly discuss the condition. So I'm confident it will help a lot of people. It will impact advances in its treatment."
I'm still listening. It sounds like I've got a big fan there. I'd actually like Rob to know if he'd read more about what I do, the presentations I do, but also the various columns that I write and some research papers. There's a chat room that I have for kids and discussions for kids with Tourette's syndrome. I've got a website, www.com, and for Rob that out, if you have any other kind, somewhere.
www.lifeatwit.com. I think you've got an inherent sense of humor. We've got another posting from, this is one that, it's tough. It's tough to cut to the chase. I don't know what's going on. My goodness. No, I shouldn't do if you have to admit the tics can look very strange or even affect me. Are you offended if people laugh better than looking away, Patty?
Yes. Well, I think she's absolutely right that it is to look. I mean, the longest time, and this actually goes back to what you're asking about what changed between the victim duck and the almost doctor duck. And one of the things that changed was putting myself in other people's shoes, and I realized, hey, if I had never heard of Tourette's syndrome, and I was walking and some guy went "Rah!" in my face, too, not because I'm a mean person, not because, but simply because people have files in their heads for how to react to, so do I react at a party, how do I react, the laundromat, and people have never written a file in their head when someone walks, and so the laughter, the jump out of look, I've learned to recognize that this is just a person's way of saying, I have absolutely no idea how to react to that. give me a file. And so I learned to do, really, I think for me, as the person with Tourette's syndrome, I need to appreciate that person's situation. And I need to stop looking at people that as being negative towards me. I need to look at here. Someone's never seen Tourette's syndrome. Educate. An opportunity person a file. So I will look, smile. If I've really started them, I'll make a little joke, like ask them if they need a clean pair of underwear or something. In a number of ways, I'll give them the information that, hey, I'm okay. I'm sorry for startling you. But I'll tell them a little bit about Tourette's syndrome, but you can't always do that even in every situation. So you just keep your shoulders back and you're maintaining eye contact, and in that way you communicate to them, I'm an okay person. I may have done a weird thing, but that doesn't mean that, you need to cross the street that I'm going to attack you or anything like that. So basically what I've got is what I call a tic buffer zone. That there are a few people that, for their own reasons, for their own lack of self-security or whatever, they decide that it's their prerogative to laugh at me for the next 45 minutes. In which case I'll usually say something back to them. But, for the people that are just going to react 2 or 3 times because they don't know what's going on, they're well within my buffer zone, and I don't think ill will of them because I realize, hey, they just need an opportunity to get used to this and to develop a poker face. And one of the ways I've tried to help people is I've put a museum of tics on my website so that people can go there and download and listen to all these different tics that people have to somewhat get used to them. If they're, for example, in teachers' college and they know they might be in a classroom with kids with Tourette's and want to basically desensitize themselves or help themselves get used to what tics sound like so that they don't react that big.
Right, I just want to say, too, that once you're around a lot of tics, too, a lot of times later on you think, oh, this person is ticking. You don't even notice it after a while because you're looking at the person. And when my puppet, McGraw, ticks, you get a real reaction out of the kids with Tourette's syndrome, kids without Tourette's syndrome, adults, what have you, with laughter because it's what is this? What is this? And then later to explain, look, I can't help this. And then the laughter sort of stops and there's more looking at the person, the pop.
Well, from my end, sorry, hello, can you hear me?
And we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Hello? We're having some technical difficulties here. Please, everyone, stay tuned, and we'll be right back with more on living with Tourette syndrome. Hello, Duncan. Hello, Duncan.
Back.
Oh, good. Okay.
What happened there? The phone ticked.
The phone ticked. Man, you know, you can't count on technology these days. The show yesterday, I opened with my personal story, you know, that it was just at the mall the other week, and I was going down the stairs with my 3-year-old son, and the man behind me just started shouting at goddamn, and then he stopped and was very calm. Was it because he was, internally, was he maybe angry with me for being slow, and he was really honest enough to voice it, or was that something else? I know you can't.
Yeah, it's hard to say in individual situations. Well,
I'm still uncomfortable with how I reacted, and now I'm even more embarrassed, but it's life.
Well, you know what? You're allowed to be human, and people aren't used to having large men suddenly start erupting into swear words at them, and so I don't hold you any ill will, and I hope that man doesn't either, that he would recognize, really, I mean, we don't get a get-out-of-life free card because we've got Tourette syndrome. We have to still recognize the impact we're going to have on people, and we still have to be responsible for it and accountable for our actions. That, you know, he probably has gotten that reaction a fair number of times because a lot of people have never seen anything like that, and so it's important that he accepts, okay, this isn't a bad person or anything, they're someone that doesn't understand. Now, to mention, to address your question, it is not unusual for tics to come out in explosions. That can partly be because of suppression, where people are holding them in, and then they just can't hold off on the itch any longer, and they have to really dig in for a second, and then they can go on again. But in general, there's some research, particularly out of Yale, down in the U.S., where they found that tics tend to follow a sporadic course like that there'll be a sort of a refractory period, I guess, where you don't see much, and then you'll see a little, you'll see an explosion and another refractory period.
And Kelly, for kids, what about any advice for them on how to handle it?
Well, I would say don't be hard on yourself. Don't beat yourself up. If you have a tic and you can't help it, it's not a bad thing to say to another kid, look, I'm just... And also to think for yourself. So if you're listening and you are teased at school or don't want to tell Tourette's, just on the good. And you'd be surprised at how many, for instance, a young girl wrote into Camilla Mike and first of all said really bad, but she's really, and she hates to wear leotard heels, and she hates her ponytail, but to stop. Something that you just don't give up. That's what I would say. So.
One thing to suggest to kids quite often is that there's so many ways that you can really shoot yourself in the foot by not talking about your Tourette syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That, for example, there was one boy that really didn't want me to go into his school and a classroom, but did something myself and the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada has trained people across Canada to go into schools and do. And for me to go in, he was so afraid that friends wouldn't like him anymore, that the couple that he had, and he was telling me, I'll give you all my dinky cards if you don't go in, and trying to make all these deals with me. But I said, well, let's just see. And so I went in and I did my thing. And afterwards I said I requested her to Tourette syndrome, and a couple people put up their hand. I said, you know, who knew that Tourette syndrome, you know, so had it in hand. And I said, okay, I got another question for you. Who here knew that every hand in the room went up? Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes people know something's going on. Whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to be different or not, whether you're trying to hide it or not, they know something's going on. If you don't give them the opportunity to understand, if you don't give them the information they need, to be able to tune yourself because they can't understand. And the other thing that happened is when I was asking for questions to this boy's best friend, he put up his hand. You could just see the stress level rise in this boy. And so I asked the best friend, yes, do you want to say something? He said, yes. I wanted to say that I want, so-and-so to know that we're not going to like him because he has Tourette's syndrome, but I want him to know that we're going to be his friend, whether he has Tourette's syndrome or not. And you could just wash over this boy. And from that day forward, the tics were a lot better in classroom because he wasn't under stress. He could walk into that room with the weight of the world off his shoulders because he knew not only does everyone in this room know I have Tourette's, but they're all okay, more friends now than I did before. I've got people out in the schoolyard being little advocates with me. It's remarkable how incredible kids can be if you give them. So I think
Sorry, I am cutting you off. I'm going to say that's all the time we have for today, and I'd like to thank both of you. And there's an email or a posting from Alice in Toronto. She says, thank you for bringing the often misunderstood worldwide awareness is better understanding. And she recommends everybody call the Tourette Foundation of Canada, 1-800-361-3120, or go to their website, www.tourette.ca.
The Foundation of Consensual Topper for sharing us on the airwaves for 2 days.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you.
Take care, Kelly.
Yeah, you can go too, Dr.
Yeah,
Okay, every day at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear about the issues that matter when it comes to your health. Next is Family Matters with Dr. Mark Jennis. Stay tuned to the Essential Talk Network where we're driving the together. Have a good weekend.